Hello, everybody. I am really excited that we're all here together. The host of this show is just coming online, Rachel Valletta from the Franklin Institute, and she has invited me. I'm a professor at Drexel University to talk to everyone about being an engineer. Uh, I am an engineer. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself and let you know a little bit about myself. I am an architectural engineer, which means that I focus on buildings in particular. And my work is about the built environment at large. So I think about how buildings exist in cities and how to make cities more sustainable. So that's sort of the research that I do. At Drexel, I teach courses in the architectural engineering program. I also have a background in architecture, so I teach courses that are more design related as opposed to theory and concept. So the students who come to me have already had a whole bunch of courses in sort of the fundamentals of engineering systems, and then I get the fun job of having the students apply those to buildings. So we do design projects, and they're mostly just about, create a building and develop the systems for it, the structural systems, the mechanical systems, the lighting systems, etc. Rachel, you're back.
Dr. Hoque, I apologize right as we went live. My Wi-Fi takes the bucket, but I am back, and I see that we are live, and it sounds like you're ahead of me on the curve here. And so I'll just say thank you to those folks joining us on Facebook. Apologies for the internet access issues. You all understand where we're coming from. So I'm on my cell phone today, but we'll make it work. Hi there, Dr. Dawn, your environmental scientist. Welcome back to another fabulous episode of our Franklin Outside series. And as you've already heard, we're joined by the even more fabulous Dr. Simi Hoque today. And Dr. Hoque, I take it that you just gave a rundown of your own research, sort of at a high level for our guests today. Do I have that right?
Yes, I did.
Fabulous. Well, thank you again for joining us, and I appreciate you working with some of our technical difficulties. So today we kind of have a special session on, let's call it Ask an Engineer. So we have an opportunity today to bring in some of our younger guests. So in addition to our usual viewers out there, thank you for joining us again and welcome back. We do have some younger guests along. So please go ahead and share out any of your questions for Dr. Hoque here as the conversation moves along. As always, we're interested in hearing from all of you. Alrighty, so I guess I was going to start by asking you to describe your work, Dr. Hoque, but maybe we could start with reviewing what it is that you shared with our group already, just so I have a sense of where we're at.
Oh, okay. So I told everybody that I'm a professor at Drexel in architectural engineering, and that my work is focused specifically on buildings and the built environment, and that my research is particularly involved in trying to figure out ways to make cities more sustainable. So I'm not just working on buildings alone, but buildings along with the other things that are on buildings that make cities such vibrant and exciting places to live. So the parks, the streets, the transportation networks, and all of that together. How do we kind of plan for making cities more sustainable for the future, considering climate change, as well as the sort of enormous growth that is taking place in cities. So many people are moving from the outside into cities, and how do we kind of accommodate that type of growth and development in a way that allows future generations to enjoy the benefits that cities offer us today.
Right, and not just enjoy the benefits, but thrive, enjoy them even more, grow those outwards. Philadelphia certainly, as you know, Dr. Hoque, is a location expected to grow in population, thanks in part to climate change. We are what some folks might call a safe haven city, and it means that we'll feel impacts of climate change. We're already feeling those impacts, but we are more fortunate than some other locations, thanks to relatively higher elevation, even though we have proximity to the coastline. And I would imagine that brings up a lot of really challenging engineering questions. And we already have one in the chat, Dr. Hoque, and I think it's a fabulous question. And it asks how we update our historical buildings in Philadelphia to make those more sustainable. I would imagine there's a lot of challenges there, not just with older infrastructure, but maybe also some policy restrictions around what you're allowed to do because these are historical sites.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, I moved to Philadelphia 5 years ago. And when I first kind of started wandering around the city, I was just so struck by how interestingly the built environment of Philadelphia looked. Like there was really old stone buildings and these shiny glass and steel skyscrapers just juxtaposed right next to each other. And that kind of contrast or clash really is exciting. But it also presents that challenge, right? How do we preserve that kind of legacy, that cultural legacy and historical legacy that is Philadelphia, that makes Philadelphia what it is? And that is actually some research that I'm working on these days. One of the things that I've been working on with an undergraduate student, a freshman actually, who just started last year, is do we have a way of measuring the values that these historic structures bring? And in doing so, can we preserve them from being destroyed or demolished or repurposed into something so entirely different that it looks like something else altogether? And so we came up with this idea of embodied culture. So a building that has been built in the past has a certain amount of embodied energy stored in it. All the energy that went into the materials, the production, the manufacturing, and the design and construction of that building is kind of embedded in that building itself. And when we pull it down, we are losing all of that embodied energy that went into the building. Today, we don't actually look into that when we are actually trying to figure out whether we're going to preserve a building or not. We look at certain other factors, like how old is this building? Is it more than 50 years old? Has it been a cultural legacy? Is it an important building? But what about the sort of slightly less important buildings that are still part of our cultural legacy? And so we're going to ask that question, like how do we preserve those and create this embodied culture concept to provide some weight to all of the buildings that are not historical legacies, but are still part of our cultural legacy. And preserving those involves things like thinking about how do we shore up the walls and the roof, what we call the building envelope, so that there's not a whole lot of losses when we are heating and cooling it. How do we make sure that the windows and the doors and things like that are updated so that we're not actually, freezing or baking inside these buildings? And then also, can we update the systems within them, the heating and cooling systems? Is it possible to do that without actually having to tear down walls? And that's a really hard thing. We have to model buildings in a way that allows us to sort of allows our models to express the importance of where the walls originally were, and then kind of move forward from there, as opposed to just saying, well, let's just tear this down, tear these things inside down. Like, there's such a thing called a gut rehab. Like you tear the inside of the building down and you redo the entire inside. And that's not what we want to do. We want to preserve the insides as well as the outsides of the building.
That's so fascinating. And this challenge of merging, these quantitative, that is to say, numbers-based issues that engineers are typically thinking about, merging that with those qualitative, maybe emotional and cultural descriptors is, I can't even imagine how we begin to go about doing that. And it's certainly an interesting notion, this idea of embodied culture. It sounds kind of out there, I think, from what many of us might think an engineer actually works on. Is this sort of a general direction of the field, or is this sort of still a niche that's starting to grow out, maybe?
Well, so a lot of the things that I think, this is my opinion, that I think are problems with the way engineers work is that we often try to solve the problem, and then we put these constraints around the problem so that we can solve the problem. And in the end, we have a lot of unintended consequences of our solutions. And this sort of blinder view, in my opinion, is one that has gotten us where we are today, where we're just really grappling with some of the most extreme stresses that our population and our environment and our buildings can handle. And so if we begin to start to integrate some understanding of how people behave, how buildings are valued, how cultures evolve in the way that we solve problems as engineers, I think that we'll probably get a little further along in terms of being able to, I don't know, solve some of these climate change and global warming problems. That said, it's still a niche kind of thing, right? Like a lot of the work that we do is about convergent research, but we're converging a lot of engineering fields. We're not necessarily converging a lot of fields that are taking into account social science frameworks. And that's what we need to do. So this is where I want to go. I want to take my engineering background and my quantitative skills and apply them with social scientists, architects, policymakers, doctors, just people across the board so that we can actually address problems holistically as opposed to, looking at them sort of in a tunnel vision.
That's so exciting and so heartening to hear. And I hope the budding engineers on the call today are hearing this call to really start to think about expanding what it means to be an engineer. So using some of those traditional engineering like problem-solving skill sets, but starting to integrate, as Dr. Hoque shared there, the social sciences, thinking about culture, thinking about health. I know that's something, Dr. Hoque, that you've thought about a lot lately. But before we get to that, we have a bunch of questions in the chat. So I'm going to pull these up and I'll just sort of rattle them off to you. So we have a question here. What about the National Historic Preservation rules and goals? The quote is, never tear down the rehabilitated ability of the old. So that's sort of more of a comment than a question there, but do you bump up against those restrictions with the National I almost said Prehistoric there, Preservation Society, excuse me.
Well, so I mean, the Preservation Society has done a fantastic job in making sure that the landmarks that are important for historically, like City Hall in Philadelphia, for example, are going to be preserved in the way that, that allows us to still look at it and say, this is from the 1800s or the 1700s. When what I'm talking about is the buildings that don't fall within the purview of the historical registry. And there are a lot of those because the registry actually has a pretty sort of strict guideline about what buildings can be preserved and what buildings should go on the registry. And not all buildings do that. So I want to expand that. The thing about historic preservation, however, is that there is a little bit like when you want to green a building, there are certain things that you would need to do that would go against what the Preservation Society would want. For example, windows in the past were single pane leaded windows. We don't need those in buildings anymore. We can actually create windows that still give the sort of impression of historical aesthetic, but perform better. And so this is something that we do push against the historical registry in order to ensure that not everything needs to be preserved. Things that are, it's a trade-off. The engineers make these decisions all the time. Where are we going to make compromises in order to make the best possible, the optimized decision for the building and for the people who are going to be in the building?
And for folks out there, you use the term there, greening a building. And I have a stab at what I think that means, but just to clarify for our group here today, does that mean just generally lowering the energy, the carbon footprint of a building, or is it more to that?
I think traditionally, if we think of the word greening as an engineer, it would be really mostly about lowering the carbon footprint and making it a higher performing building in terms of energy. But in my mind, just like the word sustainability, it's kind of vague. We can expand that definition. We can decide what it also means to be green. And for me, a green building, or to green a building, means also to make it more comfortable, to make it something that improves the well-being or doesn't undermine the well-being of people who are using it. And then it's also a building that is durable, right? It lasts a long time. You don't have to replace things a lot. And it is beautiful. It brings joy to people when they're in it.
Now, to spin off of that, I'm really curious here. You use the phrase that the buildings can help with well-being of the folks that live and work inside of them. And I think this kind of connects to something we mentioned in the event description, this idea of urban metabolism. They're not quite the same, but this idea that cities and buildings are almost living. They're a part of our living environment. And I think that's a really wild concept. Can you help us think a little bit about how buildings can actively support the well-being of humans? And then in turn, maybe we can get to that urban metabolism definition.
Okay, so I'm coming off of a year of being in a pandemic and being quarantined inside homes. We all know that we spend a significant amount of time inside buildings, whether that's your home where you were working from, or in the past your school or your office, or wherever it is that you go for the majority of your day, which is not necessarily outside. So human beings on average spend about 90% of our time inside buildings. And so this is a significant place that can have a really large impact on our health. The work that I've been doing has been looking at substandard buildings, meaning homes that are not built to really good standards. And so there are a lot of issues associated with poor air quality, poor environmental quality inside these homes. And so then they exacerbate situations in which people get asthma, rheumatism, arthritis. It's, all kinds of diseases come about as a result of people being in sick buildings. And so when we think about cities and buildings in this way, we have to consider the fact that we need to organize our buildings, design them in such a way that the first and foremost thing is to do no harm. But let's go a little further than that. Let's have buildings that allow people to thrive. Let's have buildings that bring joy to people, that don't stress them out, that actually give them a chance to relax, to enjoy, and to be able to do the work that they need to do without the building getting in the way. And so there's a lot of really exciting work in this field, and that's something that I'm really interested in and have been getting involved in. I've been working with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia in improving their indoor environments for patient well-being, with the idea, the hypothesis that the better the indoor environment, the more likely the patient is to heal faster.
Wow, that's a fascinating research finding, and it's exciting. It's really exciting to think about buildings in this way, again, almost as living, breathing, and I'm going to go ahead and say caring structures, which is maybe an unusual descriptor for a building, but I think it applies here. We've got a lot of fabulous questions coming through in the chat, Dr. Hoque. So let me pull those up again, and let's move towards one of these. Let's see here. Oh, here's a great one. Do you think that the shift towards more teleworking will have an effect on cities' environmental impact in the long term?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that has happened as a result of the work from home situation for those of us who are at Drexel is that Drexel has now been able to actually let go of some of the buildings that they've been renting because there's not that many people who are coming into the office. And when they sent a survey out asking people where they're planning on coming in and how often, something like 30% of the population of staff and faculty said they would come in. 70% that said they were perfectly happy working from home. So I think this is certainly a huge shift. I think these numbers may not necessarily be the case for all cities, because people do like to go to the office, not just because they have to do work in the office, but because there are other people there, that there's this give and take, this sharing that happens when you're in a communal environment that brings about a lot of more imaginative or innovative thinking. So I don't want to discount the idea that everybody's going to be working alone at home, because I'm not that kind of person. I thrive with other people around, and there are certainly a lot of people like that. But because we don't necessarily have to go to the office, I think that there's going to be a change in things like how much office space do we actually need? And so there's going to be more of this concept of hoteling as opposed to office spaces that belong to a single person. There's going to be more of this sort of like fluid. You can have this space, you know, when you come in, and it doesn't necessarily belong to you. There's also going to be less stress, I think, on the transportation system as a result, because there's going to be fewer people commuting, and maybe that those commute times will be shifting. We did notice in some places that the amount of pollution as a result of commuting traffic did go down, because there were fewer people who were getting into single cars and driving to work. My hope, and this is like wild hope, my hope is that at some point or the other, we can just do away with having cars in cities, and that we can start to make streets and roadways into pedestrian only spaces, and that people just commute by public transportation to their work when they need to. And the city becomes sort of almost even more compressed in a way, because the streets no longer are the things that are separating people. The streets become a space for people, just in the same way that the buildings are spaces for people, and that the spaces for cars kind of go to the outskirts of a city, and eventually go away.
Risky goals there, but I love them, Dr. Hoque. We do have the advantage of living in a city like Philadelphia, where it's a bit walkable, but it certainly could be more so, and we could make those areas safer and healthier. And I think when we allow ourselves the opportunity to dream about that, is when some of the most exciting innovations sort of come to the forefront. And hopefully, again, some of our budding engineers on the call today will help us think about those. So I want to ask one more specific question that we have in the chat about your work, and then maybe we can think a little bit more about your personal story, because you've got a really, really cool journey to your own position now at Drexel. And we have a specific question regarding the type of work that you're doing at CHOP. So that might get into the weeds a little bit, but maybe at a high level, you could summarize for us what some of those building engineering updates are that actually do help patients heal faster, as you mentioned.
So this is just beginning. It's still hypotheses, so we haven't proved it yet, but a hypothesis based on a lot of really good sort of preliminary work. And so the work we're doing at Children's Hospital is we're looking at 3 specific modalities that really influence our indoor environment. We're looking at the thermal environment, meaning how warm or cold is it and how much airflow do we have. We're looking at the acoustic environment, meaning how noisy it is. Those of you who have maybe unfortunately ever been in a hospital know that noise is a significant issue that does actually increase stress levels, beeping noises, people coming in and out, all that stuff. And then the luminous environment, lighting. And with lighting, we're looking not just at lighting, better type of lighting for the rooms, we're also looking at views, and we're looking at circadian entrained lighting. So the light changes over the course of the day. Its color and temperature changes to sort of mimic a natural day, so that we can enhance sleep, because sleep happens to be one of the single most important factors in healing. So those are the 3 things we're looking at. We're measuring them. We're talking to patients. We're trying to find out with some of the innovations that CHOP has installed in their hospital rooms, whether these innovations are panning out in terms of providing a better environment for the patients.
Okay, certainly very exciting. And so we'll have to have you on again in the future to get the update on how these research projects are progressing. And I think this connects nicely to another question that we've had come up in the chat, Dr. Hoque, that does relate to your personal story a little bit. And it has to do with more women entering engineering careers. And I love this question and the sentiment behind it. And the question is, as more women enter engineering careers, do you see the whole field moving towards incorporating public health, culture, et cetera, as you've been doing in your own work?
That's super interesting. I don't know that it's a gender thing. I know that I like to think about it. I don't know necessarily if it's something that specifically women and girls would naturally pull into engineering fields. What I would like to see is more women in engineering anyway, because I don't want to be the only woman in the room. I don't want to be the only woman of color in the room either. So I encourage, or person of color in the room. So I encourage people from all diverse backgrounds to join engineering, because even if we aren't thinking about incorporating and converging different schools of thought into engineering fields, our own backgrounds influence the way we think about our work. And the things that we have faced in our own lives, if they are diverse enough, will certainly change the way that engineering is practiced in the future, as long as we have a diversity of populations who are entering into the field.
I love that sentiment. And of course, it's one that we talk a lot about here at the Franklin Institute, ensuring that we have a diversity of voices in the room. And when it comes to engineering specifically, that diversity of voices, as you said so eloquently there, Dr. Hoque, helps us solve a more diverse array of problems in a more diverse fashion. And so it's really a win-win-win all around. And so you mentioned there that our own personal experiences do inform how we approach engineering and other STEM careers. Can you tell us a little bit about your own background and how that sort of influenced how you have approached engineering problems?
Sure. That's a long story that I'll try to keep short. But I came to America when I was 12 in 7th grade. And it was a shocking experience for me. Shocking because it's really, middle school is a shocking experience for anyone, regardless of whether they are Americans or not Americans. But I came from West Africa. I grew up in Nigeria in a very small, very cosmopolitan university community. So my parents were both teachers. My mother was a teacher, my father was a professor. And we came here, and I was very confused. I didn't understand anything about American culture. And it was really, the first few years, just completely a scramble to try to figure out who I was and where I stood in terms of the balance between my own culture, which is not African, I'm Bangladeshi, and the Nigerian culture that I brought with me, and the American culture that I was being faced with. So I really honestly did not think about STEM fields at all for the first few years of being in middle school and high school, because I was just in survival mode.
Yes.
Immigrant parents, who of course were in survival mode in the sense they were saying, you do this, you do this, you do this. So I ended up doing a lot of STEM stuff because that is, immigrant parents oftentimes say you have two choices. You can either be a doctor or an engineer. And so, all the sort of thought processes that I might have had to explore other disciplines were squashed, because I had parents who were saying, no, you can't be an artist, or you can't be an actor. What do you mean you want to be a CAD like a designer? That's not why we came to this country. But so there was a little bit of that. And then, so here's where things changed a little bit. And I was in 11th grade, I was in the diving team of my high school. And at a diving meet, I hit the diving board and I broke my neck. And yeah, I have a fantastic scar that is really amazing to look at still.
Really bad, I bet. This is my fear every time. And see, we're watching the Olympic trials right now, and this is my fear every time watching the diving. Dr. Hoque, I had no idea this was the case.
So there's some dives I cannot watch because of the dive that I broke my neck doing.
Yes.
So, but I was in convalescence for I was in the hospital for 9 weeks, thinking about how to make people more comfortable in the hospital.
Exactly.
But in a different way, because and I want to put this out there, there is no straight path. Like, if you don't have to have a catastrophic event happen to you in order to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life. And in fact, this catastrophic event that happened to me pushed me towards engineering, but I'm not a biomedical engineer. I'm an architectural engineer. So I didn't end up, like, I started there, and then I ended up kind of weaving through over the next 10 years of going to school, trying to figure out, because then I realized, oh, biomedical engineering, that's not quite it. I don't really want to do that. I want to be comfortable, but now I'm not uncomfortable anymore. So I don't really care about to do that. I really like buildings, so there were all sorts of pathways I took and explored. And the important thing is that I remained curious. I remained curious about the things that I was exploring and all the different majors that I explored in the 4 years that I went to college. I explored many majors. And you know, it took a while to end up here at Drexel and doing the things that really are interesting to me. But at no point during that path did I ever say, oh, this is it. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. It just more so happened that I was like, oh, I'm curious about that. Let's see where it goes and keep going.
I think that's a really powerful story. And as you mentioned, you don't need to have a catastrophic life event to spark an interest in a field. And certainly we hope that you don't. We're very glad that Dr. Hoque weathered hers just well. And it turns out maybe that, you know, the better for it, having faced such extraordinary adversity and, you know, that transition you mentioned culturally, and then again, that actual physical impact on having broken your neck, or such an interesting mix of life events to have produced an interest in engineering. So absolutely, as you mentioned there, remaining curious. I love that piece of advice. And you actually beat me to my next question. And it had to do with, you know, you do a lot of outreach work now with younger, especially younger girls, middle school girls that are interested in the STEM fields. And I was going to ask what your best piece of advice would be to those students. And you mentioned they're maintaining that curiosity. Would you say that that's sort of your core piece of advice for the students you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's true of anybody, even people who are my age. I think that, as I said before, with that question that was asked, you know, if more people, if more women enter engineering, will there be more of this diversity of thought? I think that as we add to our own experiences, we become more open to new ways of thinking. And so it would be incredibly important to continue to add those experiences to our repertory, to our toolkit, so that we have that ability to think outside of some narrow disciplinary pathway that has been presented to us in our coursework or in our, you know, in our office spaces. So yeah, curiosity leads to new experiences. Those new experiences lead to a broader frame of reference for solving problems.
Great. We had another great question. What's the most challenging problem that you've had to solve as an engineer?
I think, well, so there's two. One is personal and one is professional. I'm not sure what the question is asking for, so I'll just answer for both of them.
Fabulous.
The most challenging professional problem that I've faced as an engineer was a project that I worked on as an engineer to design a dispensary and a grow house associated with that dispensary. Mm-hmm. I think that there are, you know, one of the things that now we're doing, you know, it's becoming legal now to sell medical marijuana. And so we have to grow it in very specific, very, very careful environments, carefully monitored environments. And those types of environments are unlike ordinary greenhouse environments. And so it was incredibly challenging and a lot of work with people who were doing code and permitting at the government level, at the city level, to work with them to figure out what is actually permissible for a building like this, of which there were no other types. So there was no historical reference that we could use. A lot of engineering work, we kind of base a little bit on, like, we've done this way in the past, and so now we can move forward using that as a basis. There was no basis for that one, and that was really hard. So, super challenging to kind of walk down the road that no one has walked before.
Sure, make it up as you go.
Yeah, and then ask permission after the fact. And so personally, the most challenging thing I've faced as an engineer is actually the fact that I'm a woman and I'm a person of color, and oftentimes when I walk into a room, I am the only person who looks like me in that room, and so it takes a bit of courage to be able to use my voice. And so it's been a challenge because I still do suffer a little bit of imposter syndrome. When I see a room full of people who are, seem like they know what they're doing and, talk as if they know what they're talking about. And it's taken a long time for me to realize that nobody really knows everything. And so we're all just sort of scrambling through and figuring it out as we go along. And I'm not the only one who feel like an imposter. Everybody probably does. You just hide it.
Yeah, you know, that's something we hear from so many of our guests, and yourself included, many illustrious researchers who have invented incredible innovations and worked on very challenging global problems. And they all recognize that this is something we all carry, certainly as adults, but especially as adults in the STEM field. So for those of us out there that are budding engineers, this is something that we think and we grapple with. We think about a lot and we grapple with a lot. And so you are not alone if that's on your mind as well.
Yeah, and
so
I want to add to that, actually. I think that in some ways, having that sense, as long as it doesn't prevent you from trying, from being curious and from actually making that experience for yourself, then it's okay. It actually lends a little bit of humility to the work, and I think that's important.
Okay, a little bit of humility. So certainly keeping ourselves in check is important too. So let's wrap up with one last question here, and hopefully it's sort of bringing us to the optimistic part of the conversation. Certainly, what's the most fun aspect for you of being an engineer, Dr. Hoque?
Honestly, it goes back to the work that I do as an outreach person. So in my mind, the best part of being an engineer is being able to share that sort of like, look, it works experience with somebody else or with a group of people. A lot of what I do is very project based. And so we build things, we design things, and then we test them. And having the middle school girls that we work with through Girls Inc. of Philadelphia and South New Jersey work with us in exploring engineering concepts and engineering design processes and building stuff like solar cars is just, it's super gratifying. I love it, and I want to continue doing that for the rest of my life, because the sort of wide-eyed wonder of it is not something that I would ever want to go away.
And for myself and those of us watching along, we certainly hope you continue doing that for the rest of your life. You've been an absolute pleasure to chat with today, Dr. Hoque. Thank you so much. And the program that you just mentioned there, would you like to share out the name of that again for any folks watching that might be interested in checking it out in the future?
Absolutely. So Drexel University has partnered with Girls Inc. of Philadelphia, and we run a summer STEM program that is not just STEM, there is 50% of it is STEM. It's a full day summer program for the month of July. 50% is STEM, and then another 50% is personal development. So you learn about economic literacy and social media and things like that. And then another 25% of that is physical fitness and working out at Drexel Gym. And so the program is called Eureka, with an exclamation point, because that is the wide-eyed wonder part of what I love about our work. It's all project-based, it's inquiry-based. The girls do a lot of hands-on projects. And it's a commitment. You do it for 5 years, starting from rising 8th grade to when you graduate, continue to come back and you continue to develop with us. And hopefully by the end of that time, you go on to become an engineer or a scientist or somebody who's willing to work with engineers and scientists.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for sharing that, Dr. Hoque. And for those of you out there that just heard that message, we'll drop it into the chat too. That's the Eureka program with Dr. Simi Hoque, sponsored by Drexel and Girls Inc. That does it for us today. So Dr. Hoque, what we'll do here is you and I will stay on the line, and our back-end social media team will help us pause this, so there will be a bit of a lag. But for those watching from home, we'll just say thank you so much for joining us in what has been an absolutely delightful conversation for me. I hope you enjoyed yourself as well. And we'll see you next time on Franklin Outside. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
So we'll sit for a second here while Katie hits off on the Facebook side.
Okay, is it on?